So in the last several talks, we looked at architecture as a sensual experience that really spoke to our gut, our emotions. And then we talked about architecture that related in a more intellectual way to our brain or our intellect. Today, we're going to be really looking maybe more at the idea of how you make architectural form, and at a very fundamental, rudimentary element of how you make architectural form that is incredibly pervasive and incredibly essential in understanding how architectural form comes about. So there is a dictionary definition of architecture that I'm very interested in. So you know how I've got a huge, thick Webster's Collegiate Dictionary in my office, a real relic. But when you flip to architecture and you read the definitions of architecture, of course, at the beginning it's talking about architecture as buildings and the kind of thing we understand architecture to be mostly. But if you kind of file down to the sixth definition of architecture in that dictionary, it's a very interesting, maybe different notion of what architecture is. So it says, that sixth definition says, architecture is the underlying structure of anything. And what it's talking about here, it gives several examples. It says, as in speaking of the architecture of a political campaign. So if we're looking at a political campaign and we're trying to understand how they strategized there, we might look for the underlying structure of that campaign, and we would call it the architecture of that political campaign. Or we might say this is the underlying structure of this novel. So this is how the narrative comes out. This is the beginning, the middle, the end, or it's very postmodern and it's episodic. But whatever that underlying structure is, that is sometimes referred to as the architecture of the novel. Those of you in computer science are probably familiar with the very common parlance now of talking about the architecture of a piece of software. And in fact, there are courses here at UT that are in software architecture. My son works for a company and they have positions that are software architect positions. Now, they're not talking about buildings when they refer to architecture that way. They're talking about, in a software program, that kind of essence, the kind of boiling it down to a concept or an underlying structure. That's referred to as the architecture of that software. And the person who does it's referred to as a software architect. Now, why the hell is that? I mean, here's a word that's been around for eons and it meant people who made buildings. Why now do we see architecture meaning something else? And I think there's a very powerful story behind that, and it gives us an insight into the kind of architecture we're talking about. So I would say that this is so fundamental. This notion of an underlying structure is so fundamental to the making of architecture, and it's so much a part of making buildings that then it began to be applied to all other disciplines when they looked at that underlying structure. Now, many, many other disciplines have these kinds of formats or underlying structures. So for instance, if I were writing a piece of music, I might write it in a rap format. And that is an underlying structure of that piece of music. I'm first identifying a kind of format or a structure, and then I design or write the music in that format. Same way in music, something like the sonata form, that would be an underlying structure of a piece of music. 4/4 time might be an underlying structure of the music. And sometimes when we use that kind of underlying structure, we might talk about it as the architecture of that piece of music. Same way in business. I have an undergraduate degree in business and in architecture, and during the time I was taking my undergraduate degree at MIT, I was taking business in the Sloan School, and then I was taking my architecture classes at the same time. And at that point, you could cross-register at Harvard, and you could take courses at Harvard Business School if you were in the Sloan School at MIT. So I took full advantage of that, and I was taking some of my courses in Harvard Business School. I was taking some of my courses in the Sloan School at MIT. And these were, at that point, extremely, extremely different approaches to business. At Harvard, they did what they called the case study, which was all about training your intuition. You would do a whole series of case studies. If you were studying marketing, you would do how they marketed this product in this company, how they marketed this product in this company. And all these beautifully written cases that you would read and you would study and you would discuss. And by that, you would train your intuition so that when you approached a marketing problem, you had this resource of knowledge that you would apply intuitively to that instance. So that's one approach to problem solving. Very different at MIT. There was a guy there named Jay Forster. He was a god in the Sloan School. And he had what he called a systems approach to business decision making. And the systems approach was to take data and to make these very elaborate equations, and you would model the behavior of some business system, and then you would be able to tweak the variables in that and see the implications of making various decisions. So that was finding the underlying structure in that business situation, and then modeling that underlying structure and making decisions when you tweak the variables in that underlying structure. So that's what Jay Forster was up to. So some of my classes, that's very much the way you approach decision making in business. At Harvard Business School is very different and more intuitive. Well, the sort of MIT approach was so parallel to the way I was learning to study architecture, because architecture was so fundamentally about finding the underlying structure in anything. And this is deep, deep, deep in the field of architecture, and has been for centuries and centuries and centuries. One of the most famous schools of architecture ever in the world is the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. This one in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, extremely dominant school of architecture in the world, still there today. But many, many famous architects in many countries were trained at the École des Beaux-Arts. And the École des Beaux-Arts used this notion of underlying structure as the fundamental way of figuring out how to approach an architectural design problem. And they had it built into their way of teaching. So if you're at the École des Beaux-Arts, you would be given a problem at the beginning of the semester. So let's say we were designing a library for a medium-sized town. And you'd be given a site, and you'd be given the program, and you'd be told to design this library. And the way they structured it was that for the first week or two, you had to do a charrette. That's C-H-A-R-R-E-T-T-E, charrette. And the word charrette in French means cart. But that first week or two of charrette was you trying to find the underlying structure that you wanted to use to solve your design problem. So you'd be given the problem at first. You have this week or two. Everybody's scrambling around. They stay up all hours of the day and night. They're trying to figure out what is the approach, the concept that I would use. And that they called it an équisse. You were looking for the équisse for your problem, or the scheme of your problem. But it's really finding that underlying structure that will then inform all of your design decisions after that. And at the end of the week or two, then they would take a cart, a charrette in French, around to everyone's desk, and you had to take your drawings and you put them on the cart. If you were finished or if you weren't finished, everybody puts their drawings in the cart. And it was that word for cart, charrette, that came to be the word that was referred to as that period of finding the underlying structure, this quick buzz through the whole macro vision of the project to come up with an idea, a scheme, a concept, an underlying structure. Now, that became so much a part of architecture that then when we talk about underlying structure in business or in music or in software, we use the word architecture as a way of referring to that. It's so baked into what architecture is. It's so much a part of the process of finding the form of a building that in order to understand form making, we have to understand the underlying structure as a part of that. So what we're looking at today is really how this is applied in architecture. And in this talk, we're going to be looking at it at the scale of a city. If we're designing a whole city, how do we find the right underlying structure? How do we find the right ordering system? How do we kind of find a filing cabinet to put all of those other decisions about design into? And the idea here is to find an appropriate underlying structure. So it's not a random thing. It is very much chosen in response to the program or the site or the realities of that situation. So you've got to find the right underlying structure. But then if you do, it helps you make all those other decisions appropriately. And at a certain point, it has a life of its own. It begins to give form to the design problem itself. So let's talk a little about the way that works. The two examples we're going to look at primarily today are looking at an underlying structure that's based on a grid. Now, there are a zillion different possibilities of grids as underlying structures, and they're fundamental to the making of especially architecture at the scale of a city. Thomas Jefferson, when he made the Louisiana Purchase in the early part of the 19th century, he applied a grid to all of that land in the Louisiana Purchase. He put a mile by mile grid over all of it. And that was a way of subdividing it and allowing for land distribution and purchases. But then that grid was subdivided and subdivided and subdivided and became the grid for many cities in the Midwest and the whole area of the Louisiana Purchase. And in fact, that Jeffersonian grid came down as far as North Texas, and Dallas and Fort Worth are both on that Jeffersonian grid. So that was an ordering device, an underlying structure at a huge scale for how you organize roadways, which often are on that grid, towns, cities, everything. Now, in Texas, often that grid became a classic small town in Texas, a county seat in Texas. And probably many of you are from some of these towns in Texas like Waxahachie or Gonzales or Giddings or LaGrange or Lockhart or Hillsborough or Victoria. All of those are classic little county seat grid towns. So the courthouse is in the center of the grid, and then around it are the commercial buildings, the retail, making a kind of county square there. And then beyond that are the residential areas in square blocks with grids of streets through them. That is a kind of generic grid. What we're looking at today are two very specific grids as underlying structures with very specific applications to very specific problems. And the first of these we're going to look at is actually our hometown here, Austin, Texas. And there was a grid that was laid out in Austin, Texas in 1839. It's called the Waller Grid, after Edwin Waller, who was the architect engineer who laid out the city then. Actually, the site for Austin had been selected on the basis of geography. Texas had its first capital in 1836 in Washington on the Brazos. Relatively soon after that, Sam Houston became president of the Republic of Texas, and they moved the capital to a little village that was called Harrisburg. A couple of brothers named Harris had established this village of Harrisburg. They told Sam Houston, dude, if you will move the capital of Texas to our little burg, we'll rename it Houston in your honor. And he thought, sounds good. So they renamed it Houston, and for a while the capital was in Houston. Then when he was no longer president and Mirabeau Lamar became president, he said, bullshit, we don't need that vanity exercise. And at the point, Houston was deemed to not be a good location for the capital. There was a tropical climate there, high humidity, very hot. They were worried about tropical diseases like malaria then. So they decided, maybe we really don't want to be in Houston. There also was a desire to put the capital more centrally in Texas. They still had the Indians coming in from the west and threatening this new republic. They thought if the capital were a little further to the west, that could help stave off the Indians. There still were the Mexicans coming up from the south. If it were a little farther over, they might be able to kind of counterbalance that some. So Mirabeau Lamar sent an expedition up the Colorado River in central Texas and said, look for a site for the new capital city of the Republic of Texas. And as they came up that river, they saw a slow rise of land that came up from the river. And as it rose up here, then there was a hill, a very distinctive hill that was quite higher than everything else around it right there. And as they came up the river, they thought, wow, perfect. That's where the Capitol building sits. And there will be a long street that connects it to the river, and that will be the perfect site for a capital city. The symmetry was very much a part of it here. There was a bluff on one side to the east. There was a bluff on the other side to the west. There was a creek that ran through here at the base of that bluff that's now Waller Creek. There's a creek that ran through the base of that bluff that's now Shoal Creek. So you got the slow rise up to the hill, the framing of the bluffs on either side, the creeks on either side, and that geographically said to them, wow, that's a perfect place for a capital city. So they laid down the grid here, 14 blocks by 14 blocks, and nestled it into that geography. This is an underlying structure that's responding to geography, responding to that slow slope, responding to that hill, responding to those bluffs, responding to those creeks. And evidence of that, when they named the streets, they named the east-west streets for trees in Texas, geographical features. So you get bodark and live oak and cypress and peach, and all of those are streets in the east-west direction. Later on, they became numbered streets, as they are today. And then the streets in the north-south direction were named after the rivers of Texas. And they were in the geographical sequence of the rivers as you move from east to west across Texas. So this was East Avenue right there. Then came Sabine and Natchez and Trinity, and then San Jacinto and Brazos, and Congress Avenue became that central spine going up to the Capitol building. And then the rivers continued on the other side, and it was Colorado and Lavaca and Guadalupe, San Antonio, Nueces, Rio Grande. Rio Grande's the westernmost river, like Sabine's the easternmost river, and then West Avenue. So again, geography is the provocation, and they're creating an underlying structure for the city that's very responsive to the geography of the site and based very much in the geography of Texas. And then from that began to tell you then exactly where other design decisions would happen. So that major street leading up to the hill, Congress Avenue, that begins to be clustered with all of the commercial buildings. So they're lining up along Congress Avenue. 6th Street was the highway that went out to Bastrop in the east and went to Marble Falls in the west. It became a secondary commercial street. There were 4 open parks there and there and there and there, and they began to have a completely different use, and the things around them were shaped by those equally spaced 4 parks that are there. Those 3 of the 4 are still there. That's Brush Square, Republic Square, that still exist in downtown. Here we can see a slide of the city in 1850. Shortly after it was founded, that's that little hill, and we see the original Capitol building, which was a warty, nasty little thing. There you see the governor's mansion right there. Luckily, that building burned down, and in the 1880s, it was destroyed, and they had then built a much more appropriately scaled building that really held the scale of that hill in the center of the ensemble. This was Congress Avenue in that same period, leading down from the Capitol building. And even early there, you can see how all of the commercial structures are lining up along Congress Avenue, and then it very quickly turns into residential areas on either side. This is back to that drawing from the 1880s. You see now the new Capitol building on the hill. At this point, the university has its old main building on the next hill up. Again, geography dictating the underlying structure. This is Congress Avenue as it's coming down from the Capitol building fairly intensely there. There you can see 6th Street in the other direction, lining up the commercial buildings. And then this area down toward the river was a little bit flood prone. They put the railroad through there. They then put warehouses and things like that, not so much, not less important buildings. And because the railroad went through there, then that began to be the marketplace, and the square down there, Brush Square, becomes to be the market square, and that locates that function in the building. Now, the point of all of this is that first you take a notion of geography. This has powerful geography. We need to find an underlying structure that organizes that geography. You then find a particular kind of grid, not one with the courthouse in the center and equal on all sides. No, it's gestural to identify this valley between 2 bluffs and the hill and Congress Avenue, and a particular grid is laid out there. And then all the decisions about where commercial buildings go, where residential buildings go, where marketplaces go, where institutional buildings go, where iconic buildings go, they begin to be sorted out according to that underlying structure. And to this day, when many of you came from another city and you came to Austin, it was that underlying structure that made it easy to understand how you move around in this city. How do I get down to 6th Street? 6th Street has continued to be that iconic kind of central feature in the building because of its role in the underlying structure from the beginning. Congress Avenue the same way. So to this day, now we have many different grids. That's that original grid right there. There's the grid of the university that got applied later, the grid of Hyde Park, which we see up here. Many different neighborhoods responding to different exigencies around. But the nature of the city today is very much based on that underlying structure that was applied in the grid way back in the 1830s. Now, just to show how this works in another instance, we're going to talk for a minute about the city of Savannah in Georgia. And it's a grid, but it's a very different provocation for that grid and a very different underlying structure that came of it. So the city of Savannah was founded by a guy named James Oglethorpe. And his goal was, he was an Englishman, and he was very sympathetic to poor people in England who, when they couldn't pay their bills, they threw them in jail. Well, you can never earn money to pay your bills if you're in jail. So there would be people sentenced to jail because of non-payment of their bills, and they're destined for their families to be destitute forever. So he said, this is a ridiculous system. These are not bad people, they just couldn't pay their bills. So he had the idea of taking these people out of the jails and taking them to the colonies in America and setting up a colony there that would be for people who were in jail only because they couldn't pay their bills, and let them have a fresh start and let them make some money, pay their bills back in England, and set up a new culture in the United States. So he got permission to do that. He got some land from the crown in Georgia, and he said by such a colony as he intended to do, families who would otherwise starve will be provided for and made masters of their land. And it's all about a social purpose. So now, honestly, the site he was given had very little geographical character. It was just woods and flat. So there was no geographical provocation here, as there was in Austin. But there was a very strong social provocation. How can I make an underlying structure of this community that will help these people get on their feet, that will help them form a sense of community, have the ability for upward mobility, the aspiration to do better, to make a better life for myself and my family. So he's trying to create an underlying structure for the city that will encourage a very strong social sense of community and a sense of aspiration for the people that are there. So he chooses a very different grid. And this one, it's based on what's called a ward. One of those little squares is a ward. In the center of the ward is a little park space. And initially, in 1735, there were only 4 of those wards. And then there got to be 6, and then there got to be 8, and they grew and grew. And the idea was the city would get, as it got bigger and bigger, it would add more and more and more wards. But each ward, each little neighborhood community would have this central focus and this park and a way of having an identity as a social unit together. That's what a ward looked like. It had the park in the center there. It had 4 blocks right here, which were called trustee blocks. And those were meant for, it might be a church, it might be a civic institution like a bank, or it might be a leading citizen's home. So if you really got successful, you might be able to afford to live on one of those trustee blocks right here. So those were kind of special blocks. And then there would be the more ordinary fabric of everyday people's homes that are in the other blocks around. And that would be a ward or a small community centered on that park. And by the way the streets are laid out, in between the wards, you can go continuously through the city. But in the center of the ward, the park interrupts the street, so you get to get more pedestrian movement through here, more efficient vehicular movement on the streets around the ward. So those trustee blocks became the place for the more iconic or landmark buildings in the city. And then on the other streets and the rest of the fabric, it would be more ordinary homes for regular citizens. And there was always that sense of aspiration. If I get successful, I could move to a trustee block. I could have one of those badass kind of landmark homes that was on one of those blocks. And each ward had the ability to be, yes, someone who was successful, maybe a wealthier person, and then there were plenty of places for middle-class people there, and there were always places for affordable housing, for people of lower income. So within a ward you would get the whole microcosm of people who were at the kind of upper rung of financial success and people who were at a more modest level. This built into Savannah this idea of diverse communities that are able to be in close proximity to each other and be unified by this little park that's at the heart of it. And in fact, they brought in all these people who had not been successful in England and had been put in jail for their debts, brought them over, and it was a very successful community economically. But again, it's the underlying structure of that city was based on this social purpose, and the grid was very much a result of that social purpose, and then a provocation for the way people lived and the way they built buildings and the way they developed their city as a whole. So in the next talk, we'll look at this applied more at the scale of a building, but you can certainly see how architecture as the underlying structure of anything is inspiring for the making of form at the scale of a city. Okay, see you next time.